you very much, Jason. Thank you very much for letting me speak here. At lunch, I was told, I hear ICES are trying to push into the Arctic. I just want to make it clear that our oldest working group is the Arctic Fisheries Working Group, which has been going for at least 40 to 50 years. Okay, this is my talk, Making the Ecosystem Approach Operational in the Atlantic. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to be a bit cheeky and talk to you about a workshop we ran in January. And the workshop was part of the Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance, which is linked to the Galway Statement when the European Union said we want to work and have fun with Canada and the USA, and we're going to do that in the Atlantic Ocean. So this workshop was brought together under the Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance Work Package Ecosystem Approach to Ocean Health and Ocean Stresses, and I am the work package leader for that. And the objective of the workshop, which was jointly run with NOAA, DFO and FAO and ICES, was to explore the strengths and weaknesses of recent implementation of ecosystem-based management, focusing on the challenges for cross-sectoral approaches. So it's not EBFM, it's EBM, although we did have EBFM examples. The way we did it was we were quite keen that we used practical examples of ecosystem-based management where people had attempted to operationalize or had successfully operationalized ecosystem-based management. And we used case studies from, I think it's 13 places. We used an online survey which we sent out to people like OSPAR and HELCOM, which are the regional seas commissions in Europe, and also to NOAA and to DFO and to other groups. And then we worked in working groups throughout the workshop, and we had 54 participants from across the world, really, including Australia. We were very lucky that we were joined by David Smith from CSIRO, who brought the Australian example to the table as well. The crucial thing is a lot of this was qualitative. There's almost no forum or no collection of metrics at the moment to explore different ways in which ecosystem-based management has performed or not performed around the globe. And so it was very much bringing everything together and discussing what was good and what was bad. And it was our perception of what was good and what was bad. It was not a metric. So, why use the ecosystem approach? There is a political need, and that's been shown in one of Jason's slides. That was very clear. But also there are the operational benefits. There are trade-offs which are made explicitly. There's ownership for the process. There's a spectrum of approaches that can be used, and we've already highlighted throughout this workshop that different places are doing it in different ways and different incremental methods. And there's ability to adapt to complex challenges, because we never get it right. We always have to go through the loop all the way. The good thing that came out of the workshop, and in my job being called the Ecosystem Approach Coordinator, is that people say, no one really understands it. Jason touched on it, Heimruna touched on it. There was a huge shared understanding about what we mean by the ecosystem approach. It's about balancing what's going on. And what the balance is we have a dynamic ecosystem where we have predator-prey interactions, we have global change occurring, we have habitats under threat or habitats doing well, and all of those are balancing and affecting the ecosystem as a whole. And then we have people who are sitting here who are using the services and also impacting the ecosystem. And both of those are balancing, and they've got different needs, different trade-offs, different wants and objectives need to be reconciled. And then overall, we've got those balancing along the way. So we have humanity and society, and we have the ecosystem which we're exploiting and impacting. So it's the phrase that came out of the workshop was balancing human activities and environmental stewardship in a multi-use context. Now, when I showed this picture to someone, some of you may know Doug Butterworth, some may not. He's quite a vociferous South African chap. He said, Mark, you're now saying that ecosystem approach is about understanding everything. You're now saying that to get the balance right, we need to know everything and every little tweak that's going on in the system. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying focus on the priorities. What are the big wobbles in this seesaw? What's going on? And that's the kind of message we're trying to get across, and that's what this entire workshop shared. The other thing that came through from the workshop was the shared common understanding about the processes that are required within ecosystem-based management. It's evidence-based. It's about your knowledge, and that can be quantitative, it can be qualitative, it can be traditional knowledge. It's trans and multidisciplinary. It's going across many sectors of our science and our knowledge base. It's participatory, it's adaptive, has to involve adaptive management. You must set boundaries and limits, and it has to involve some form of evaluation throughout all of the process. So across the board, people said this is what we thought was required when you enter the realm of ecosystem-based management. So we then looked at all the case studies. And we had discussion groups, and we looked at the online survey. And in fact, the online survey results are hopefully going to be published soon in the ICES Journal of Marine Science. And the properties of success that we saw across all these case studies was a transparent and trusted evidence base was key to provide success. And those people providing that evidence base need to be seen as honest brokers. Heinruna already touched on that. It's that honest brokerage which is so important. There need to be mechanisms for setting objectives and priorities. Players need to understand their role in the process. And I was a bit cheeky with Heinruna when I questioned the scientist's role in the process. We all need to understand what our limits and what our limitations are, and we also need to understand what we bring to the table. We need realistic ambitions. I'm going to give you a few examples of some operationalized ecosystem-based management approaches where the ambitions were not really realistic and it failed or didn't go according to plan. You need to have a governance framework that honours the outcomes, and I'm definitely going to come back to this issue. There were plenty of examples where the governance promised things, and then once the process had gone through, it didn't deliver. You need the right people at the right tables with equity, and that equity is crucial. And you need to really acknowledge the limits to your understanding. So you've got to sit there and actually realize we don't know what's going on and accept it. And don't say, wait, stop. We have to study this more and more. As Jason alluded to, you accept those limits and you set something in motion to improve your science or your knowledge base and move on. And recognize existing sectoral objectives and incentives. And some sectors will come to the table in a much more powerful position than some of the other incentives. And my question to you is, why have I put up Tom Hanks up there? Can anybody suggest why? Oh, I've got another thing. I'll come back to that. Apparently, again and again in surveys, he's considered the most trustworthy person in the United States. So, there you go.
That's not saying much.
No, it's not saying much. I've never heard that. But I'll come back to the last bullet point. You should have a participatory tool development. So these were the properties of success in ecosystem-based management across those case studies that we have. So rather than saying the failures, I'm going to use the phrase short of expectations. And the operationalizing examples that were given had problems when there were issues of trust, when there were issues in terms of incentives and stakeholder buy-ins, when there was no shared articulated need for the objectives or the approach or the process as a whole. Governance honouring outcomes, I've already touched on that, and delivering expectations and timeframes. Different sectors have different expectations in terms of the timeframes of delivering a process. Now that came through quite clearly. I'm going to give you some examples. The role of political leadership. We've heard already about the Norwegian high-powered, straight from the top of government decision that we will have management plans. Okay? And that has been pushed across ministries in Norway. And we're viewing that as basically a success. And we're saying there are obviously problems and issues, but the government's major decision, we will have these plans. Now, in contrast, Martine gave a very rosy picture of the Canadian system, but the people at the workshop were quite critical about the failure of the governments in Canada about the moving forward with the loaners. Now, that's changed again with the change in government, and we'll see how that goes. But they went through a very expensive, very complicated process, which lots of people in that process felt was very constructive, and then the political leadership said, well, no, actually, we're not that interested. But that's now swapped around, and we'll see what's happening again in Canada. So that's an example of where things get quite sticky. An interesting one, though, was we also had an example from the Caribbean. And this was EBFM, Fisheries Management. And there they were beginning to work in what is perhaps one of the most politically complicated parts of the world. And we had a talk by Lucia Fanning on how complex it was to try and reconcile ecosystem-based fisheries management in the Caribbean. If you think the Arctic is complicated, believe me, it's not. You go to the Caribbean, and then it gets really messy. So, another one that was short of expectations was actually how it worked, how you managed to get it to operate, the framework, the methods. If there's no clear framework for implementation, once you've gone through some degree of the process, then you're likely to hit some trouble. The role of science in an applied process is also something that must be considered quite a lot. Scientists have a role to play, but they have to be very careful about how that role develops within that system, that process. Okay. There are a few transferable metrics between sectors and between parts of the process, and you've got to make sure that you develop a shared currency for the trade-offs that are going to come along further down the line. And we've got the issue of policy ahead of science, and I'm going to come back to that in a tick. Here we are, policy ahead of understanding. What we have is a quite well known in the fisheries world figure in the middle here, which is by Jake Rice, where he suggests that science develops in a kind of a linear way, incremental, we get bit by bit, whereas policy makes great big jumps. And the suggestion is that in Australia, with the oceans policy from 1998, they said we want to manage our oceans in this way. We will use the science to underpin all our decisions. And apparently the scientists weren't ready. It was a real kick to the scientists. They found that they had to work really hard to try and fulfill the political agenda that had been set before them. In the same way, in Europe, and I've put up a picture there from OSPAR, we've now got the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and that gives us 11, we call them descriptors, where we have to set good environmental status, and the scientists have to give the policymakers the information on what we mean by good environmental status. Now that's fine for fisheries-ish. It gets more complicated for food webs, biodiversity, marine litter, underwater sound, all of these things. So there was a real jump in terms of the policy, but the science wasn't quite there in time, and that was a real challenge. Now, many of the authors on this talk were from other areas, and they disagreed with us, and they certainly felt that there hadn't been those policy jumps yet, and the science was there to underpin it. So there is some small tension on this slide. Another one is buy-in and incentives. What we had there was a very good set of presentations by the Celtic Seas Partnership, and this relates to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive again, in the Celtic Seas region. And the Celtic Seas Partnership has basically mostly been set up by WWF, working with the local authorities and some of the ministries around the Celtic Seas. And they interviewed, it was something like 5,000 people, it's not on there, but from 22 different sectors, and managed to begin to get people to start talking about objectives for good environmental status in their areas. Likewise, we had the talk by Mark Monaco, from NOAA, talking about how the exploration of Massachusetts of the shipping lanes and the whales, in the end, the industry decided to move the lanes without any legislation whatsoever because they saw the value, the buy-in and the incentives. And they now added 20 minutes extra steaming time to avoid those errors. Then we were given an example from Ecuador where, unfortunately, because of the failure to understand what was important to the stakeholders, the small-scale fishers entered into what they thought was an ecosystem-based fisheries management process, and in the end, actually, it resulted in worse stock status and those kind of things. So that was the problem. So, options for progress. Important to develop frameworks for implementation. There are a couple of things coming online that I've seen about what do you do once you've got your plans set up, but I think there needs to be more work. Acknowledge the power of and ownership between sections, the power of sectors and the ownership between sectors. Acknowledge that in the end you get down to dividing that pie. There are trade-offs coming down the road. Use whatever government mandate exists. There are lots of people who expect perhaps a Norwegian example of a high ministerial kind of decision. Here we go. Often that's not going to happen. Use whatever governance, or find an honest champion. Often a lot of these exercises are pushed through by champions. And use momentum but temper expectations. Tempering expectations is quite important, particularly when you start working with stakeholder engagement. We basically said that there were issues in terms of making successful ecosystem-based management, in terms of the governance, in terms of the sectors and the stakeholders that you engage with and how you do it and how you create a legitimate process, and in terms of the knowledge, the legitimacy and the translation of that knowledge, and of course acquiring new knowledge. It's not that we're saying that there is enough knowledge. You've got to keep improving and getting more knowledge. So, there is an interesting set of work that's just come out of some of the EU projects on ecosystem-based management systems. It was done by Lawrence Mee, who sadly passed away last year. But his group is, or the network he set up, is continuing to bring about and talk about frameworks for implementation. Right, as I leave, I'm going to say options for progress. This is my personal note from a purely scientist perspective. That's what I am. As they leave the science closet, knowledge brokers need to be aware and empathetic to the arena in which they are entering. So, conclusions, broad agreement of concepts and best practice was reached by the whole workshop, so that was good. Successes are associated with mechanisms for setting objectives and priorities, getting buy-in, understanding the respective roles, and realistic ambitions, and a tangible knowledge base. Failures were associated with misunderstanding incentives, poor stakeholder buy-in, and institutional and governance issues. And it came through in case after case after case. Institutional and governance issues are quite high up there. Greater attention to developing appropriate governance frameworks and leaderships is required. And the roles of the actors in the process needs to be considered by all. And it was all part of the order. Thank you.